the presentation. So we'll just I can actually do both. So if there are questions, put them in the chat and I will respond.
And I can also keep an eye out for questions that come up in the chat too.
Okay.
Oh, it looks like we just lost Michael.
Huh.
Might be a Wi-Fi issue like we had here at the office.
We'll give him a couple minutes and then
Here he is. Hi, Michael.
Hi. Yeah.
So I think we're all set to get started. And again, if you have any questions, like Laura said, feel free to put it in the chat.
All right. Thank you so much. Michael is one of our community educators. He is amazing. He's a social worker and has a lot of experience working with all kinds of people around Alzheimer's and dementia. He also leads a couple of our VA support groups, which we can talk about later. But let's go ahead and get started.
Yeah, thank you, Capitol Hill Village. Thanks, Laura, for that introduction. And let me briefly just share, I come to this not only as a volunteer, but also as a former caregiver. My wife was diagnosed at age 54 with early onset dementia. And 3 years after that was diagnosed fully with Alzheimer's disease and regretfully passed away in 2017 from complications of Alzheimer's. And when I retired from Georgetown University in the latter part of 2020 and 2021, I started giving back as a volunteer. So delighted to present Managing Money, a Caregiver's Guide to Finances. And let me say at the outset that the Alzheimer's Association has developed this program with input from experts. However, neither Laura or I are attorneys, nor are we financial planners. And so just want to put that disclaimer out there, and everybody's situation is going to be unique. But this is if you will, kind of a high level overview of managing money. And we'll go through some of the hopefully tips that you can utilize for yourselves this afternoon. So why don't we go to the next slide? And I just want to read this disclaimer, emphasizing what I just said, that this education program contains only general information on legal, financial, care, and medical issues, and is not meant to be a substitute for professional advice. Laws vary by state and are surely each one of us has unique circumstances. So we make no warranty or guarantee of the accuracy or reliability of the information contained herein. You should clearly consult with your own legal, financial, or other medical professionals before acting on any of the information that we will share with you this afternoon. So just want to be very clear that this is a general overview. Each of your circumstances are going to be unique, but this is a guide. It's a roadmap, if you will, that will help reinforce. And here's some of the agencies and organizations that have helped provide input. This is the steering committee that helped us develop this program, as you can see. So let's move on to the next slide. Our takeaways for this afternoon: describing how caregiving affects your finances, listing the legal and financial documents that you as caregivers should have in place for your loved ones and for yourselves, frankly. Prepare for useful discussions about financial decisions and planning. Identify steps to lower the chances of financial abuse and fraud. And then finally, beginning to create a backup plan in case you can no longer provide care. So hopefully these are the things we'll touch upon and you can take away for yourselves this afternoon. Some of the key terms that we'll be using: the word caregiver describes a family member, friend, or legal guardian who supports someone with their health needs and well-being. Caregiving often includes assistance with activities of daily living, like bathing or dressing, particularly the middle to latter stages of Alzheimer's or other forms of dementia. And clearly, in the course of the progression of the disease, you're going to be helping with things like paying your loved ones' bills, shopping, managing money, things of that nature. Some of you may also hear or prefer the term care partner. And what we mean by care partner is that early on in the process, as an example, when we realized at age 54, my wife had early onset dementia, she was able to give input, both in terms of her finances. And we'll talk about this, she was willingly, after I discovered that she was having some challenges writing her bills, and everything she wrote was ATM. And I'm like, Bernita, that was her name. Sweetheart, you're writing a bill to American Express, or you're paying Pepco or what have you. You're not writing to ATM. Can I take a look? And that's when I discovered some of the challenges she was having with paying bills and balancing her checkbook. So being able to help her with that over the course of time. But she, again, was willing to do that and gave some input. You're going to hear the word finance, and that refers to money and things that are worth money. This includes including household cash flows, bank accounts, credit cards, insurance policies, things of that nature. And it's important to talk about financial literacy, which means understanding how managing money, such as handling day-to-day expenses and how to plan for the future, is important. If it is a challenge, seek out additional resources. So I just wanted to make sure you're understanding how to manage not only your money, but your loved one's money. So let's move on to talk about the cost of caring. Financial literacy is especially important for you all as caregivers, no matter which illness the person may have. So not only are we talking about issues like Alzheimer's or dementia, it could be other chronic issues. It could be MS, it could be Parkinson's, it could be any chronic illness. It's important and it's critical to ensure that you all are aware of financial literacy and things that you'll need to ensure that you have things in place legally and financially as you go along. Just check your knowledge, and I will quickly just go ahead and answer this for you for the sake of time. What percentage of caregivers have out-of-pocket expenses? 78%. More than 3/4 of caregivers have out-of-pocket costs as a result of caregiving, including household and medical expenses. So as you can see, it's quite costly to be paying for things like this. These household expenses includes things like your mortgage payments, home modifications, medical expenses, things often that are not covered by medical insurance, the commode that you might need to put in your homes, maybe modifications to your house if you're trying to make sure your loved one is living in place, things of that nature. And clearly, caregiving can impact finances in a number of ways, particularly as an example, unemployment. Because of the intense amount of time people spend providing care, caregiving may affect one's employment. Even though I worked full-time as an example, oftentimes I had to take time off. I had my late wife, in daycare, and on occasion, the electricity went out. We lived in Montgomery County. If there was a snow day during the winter and the school system closed, the daycare program closed. So I had to stay home and take leave. For hourly employees, that can be quite challenging because if you don't have leave and you're not working, you're not getting paid. Many caregivers end up having to cut their hours. They have, as I said, in my situation, they may have to take time off. These decisions can mean lost income, again, particularly for those who are hourly. It may increase more debt, difficulty saving for retirement, or other things you're trying to save for. And many people don't realize how expensive it can be to take care of others. So we're going to hear from a real life example in this video, hearing from a caregiver, Kim.
So some of the sacrifices I've had to make financially due to having to care for my mom were things like paying for some of her care, doctor visits in some cases, clothing, to try to limit the spend down of her money. So I supplemented where I could, and then retired early, which impacted my income to continue to care for her, and then looking into getting a part-time job to supplement her memory care, facility care.
Right. I would be curious when we get to the Q&A, how many of you might have something like long-term care insurance in place? I was very fortunate way before any manifestation of my late wife's illness. In 2005, we had a very comprehensive conversation about long-term care, finances. This all came about because her own mom was diagnosed in her 80s with dementia. And in 2005, we had to put her mom into assisted living. And so we were making sure we had our own finances in place. Impact on health. Let's talk about how being a caregiver affects us. Caregiving and managing financial challenges can impact our own health. It's a high level of stress. It can be a high level of burden. It can lead to our own exhaustion and uncertainty. Caregivers may put off taking care of their own health. So you're not going to the doctor. Particularly in the course of the pandemic, many of us had to shelter in place. And so we put off caregiving responsibilities for ourselves in terms of going to the doctor. Our own stress levels increase. There was some research that indicated for caregivers, anywhere from 30 to 40% of caregivers struggled either with depression or anxiety disorders. So as you can see, we need to make sure we're taking care of ourselves. The proverbial notion when you're flying, the flight attendant says, if you were losing cabin pressure, pull that mask down, put it on yourself first, and then put it on your child or whomever is with you. So it's important that we're mindful of taking care of our own health. Let's move on to the next slide. Let's talk about how indeed Alzheimer's affects finances. Every illness brings different medical, emotional, and financial challenges for caregivers, but caring for a person living with Alzheimer's or other forms of dementia can be major. Here's a question, and I'll go ahead and provide the answer for you. Do you think Alzheimer's is a normal part of the aging process? And the reality is the answer is false. Alzheimer's is a progressive neurodegenerative fatal brain disease. It is not part of the aging process. Symptoms usually develop slowly and can worsen over time, and they will affect one's activities of daily living on a persistent basis. We all, from time to time, might forget where we've put our keys. We might forget where we parked our cars. We might forget somebody's name. I know sometimes I even struggle with adding my checkbook, but then I quickly say, oh, wait a minute, I made a mistake here. Oh, that's right, I left the keys upstairs in the bedroom. They're not down in the dining room where I thought I had left them. So we can retrace our steps. So again, Alzheimer's is a fatal disease. It's not part of the normal aging process. Moving on. Alzheimer's only affects a person's memory. That's false. Not only is memory impacted, but people's thinking, behavior, ability to problem solve, and again, eventually as the disease progresses, activities of daily living are impacted. Ability to feed oneself, dress oneself, bathe oneself, all of those things end up being impacted. So it's a pretty brutal and progressive disease. Quickly, we're going to talk about the progression of the disease. It usually progresses slowly through 3 stages: the early stage, the middle stage, and the late stage. The symptoms of Alzheimer's worsens over time. On average, a person with Alzheimer's lives 4 to 8 years. In some instances, it can be even longer than that. Moving on. The impact on, financial impact. Oh, okay. So in the beginning, people may have trouble managing their money and remembering to pay bills. As the disease progresses, it gets worse. They're no longer able to do that. Again, early planning, it's critical. It's never too late to start the conversation. If you've not had that conversation, and we'll talk in a moment about how to do that, but the sooner we can figure out where our legal documents are, where our financial documents are, it allows us to put in place some things, particularly again, if somebody's in the early stages. As I mentioned, they can have some input as to what's going on with their legal and financial situation. So moving on. This one just basically says, as income goes down, expenses go up. And we have seen that during the pandemic, and we'll hear from a caregiver in this regard.
So when we finally moved into assisted living, when we first got the cost, it was going to be $5,000 a month. When we started adding on daily medications and housekeeping and all the other things that come with it, we were quickly at $6,000 per month. In my mind, every month I was, doing the calculations of, all right, how much money does Dad have left? How long can this last? What happens when that goes away?
So you can see the impact. Clearly, unique challenges of dementia caregivers. Dementia caregivers have twice the average of out-of-pocket caregiving expenses. 30 to 40% of dementia caregivers experience depression, as I mentioned earlier. Also, 44% have anxiety. Finally, women are more likely than men to experience the stress of caregiving because 2/3 of caregivers, unfortunately, are women. It's kind of a dual issue. Women outlive men, so therefore you're living longer and you're taking care of us as men. On the other hand, living longer than us, women are more at risk to develop Alzheimer's or other forms of dementia than men. So let's move on to the next slide. And again, this is another one, checking your knowledge. The question is, do you think people younger than 65 can develop Alzheimer's? And that's true. As I mentioned, in my wife's mid-50s, she developed Alzheimer's, unfortunately, early onset dementia initially, but by her late 50s, Alzheimer's. While older age is the greatest risk factor for Alzheimer's, and most individuals living with Alzheimer's are older adults, people younger than 65 can also develop. About 5% of the younger onset dementia folks, there may be some genetic or familial component. As I mentioned, in my late wife's situation, her mom was diagnosed in her 80s with dementia, and that may have been a factor as to why Bernita herself ended up with Alzheimer's. Moving on to the next slide. Some additional financial challenges. As I mentioned, younger onset. People living with younger onset, many report losing or quitting one or more jobs. I know for Bernita, she even realized she was, believe it or not, director of financial aid and admissions for Catholic University School of Social Work. Bernita was also a social worker like me. She had to quit her job. And for a year and a half after that, she attempted many other jobs. And unfortunately, because as her health and the progression of the illness increased, she couldn't function. She couldn't figure out computer systems. She couldn't keep track of things. She got fired from 2 other jobs. And eventually she applied for unemployment. And eventually, as the illness got even worse, she ended up applying, and we were fortunate to get Social Security disability. The other thing to be aware of is sometimes you can't even get FMLA or COBRA. Let's talk about LGBTQ, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender questioning. Oftentimes, members of this community are single. They don't have a spouse or partner. They don't have, unfortunately, maybe a social network or caregiving network that help take care of them. They don't have children. And so they're struggling by themselves and they're needing assistance. Luckily, there are resources that can help members in the LGBTQ community with these sorts of things. Moving on to the next component group is low-income individuals. They're less likely to be financially prepared for the cost of caregiving. Again, they may be hourly, they've not saved, they don't have long-term care. They have fewer opportunities because you're living paycheck to paycheck. You're basically trying to survive. There may be increased debt. The biggest debt most of us do have, particularly if we don't have financial stability, is things around healthcare. One major healthcare issue comes up and it can be devastating, even impacting our savings and finances. Added caregiving stress, but less ability to pay for resources, as I mentioned. So let's move on. The other thing, as we're talking about the benefits of early detection and early planning, it's important to be able to think about how we're going to put things in place. And, when we talk about the benefit of putting financial plans in place, it's not just about people who have lots of money or don't have money or caregivers. It's everyone. Let's click on that just to emphasize. Many people assume that financial planning is only helpful for people who make a lot of money, but it's critical It's proactive that each one of us, every single one of us, regardless of our financial status, have some sense of financial planning. What are we doing for savings? What are we doing for emergencies, medical emergencies, the proverbial rainy day funds? So financial planning can help ensure to cover costs. It can help prevent financial hardship in the future. Now let's talk about some of the benefits of early planning as we go to the next slide. There are benefits to putting financial plans in place as soon as possible, knowing the person's wishes. So luckily, when Bernita and I began to have the conversations in 2005, as I mentioned, in light of putting her mom in assisted living, we had a sense of what we were doing. We were able to get long-term care insurance. These days, I don't even think long-term care insurance exists. Many insurance companies don't write those policies anymore, or if they do, they're very short-windowed and they're exceptionally expensive. It's important to know what's going on in terms of how to handle financial issues and how you're going to pay for it. And also, it's less chance of making the spur of the moment financial decisions. So we're going to hear from an expert, we're going to hear from a caregiver to talk about benefits of early
One
planning.
of the benefits of putting financial plans in place for caregivers is simply peace of mind. Oftentimes we have a lot of anxiety and fear about the unknown. How long is the disease going to last? What are the care needs going to be? When we think of all of those things that we might be apprehensive about, and we put plans in place for, if this happens, here's how we'll handle it. And we really think through, here's what's typical with the disease, here's what I need to be thinking about, and here's my plan for that. It can be such a gift to the whole family because people can settle in and focus on, here's what I need to focus on today, here's what I need to think about right now, without the weight of the what ifs hanging over their head.
My mother, by putting plans in place early, that really helped me because it gives me a sense of confidence that I'm doing the things that she really wants to be done. It allows me to not have to worry about decisions that I make because my mother has already laid out the plan. She's stated her wishes, and my role is really to execute those plans. I have found that making decisions for my own situation can often be difficult. And so it's even harder to make decisions, especially when it comes to medical decisions, financial decisions. To have that responsibility of making those decisions for someone else can be very, very difficult. So in that my mother was so prepared and had laid out financial plans and really had a structure around her life, that has really allowed me to be less anxious as I perform the caregiving role.
I like what Gail said, that her mom laid out a plan. So that made it easier for Gail. And again, if we can have those earlier conversations financially, legally, estate planning, how we're going to deal with those sorts of things. So again, the benefits of early planning for individuals, the ability to share exactly what they want, whether it's healthcare directives, financial, reassurances that others know their wishes. So there's no guessing game. Oh my gosh, should we put mom in an assisted living facility or not? What are we going to do with the life insurance? What are we going to do with the savings account? Relief from having legal and financial plans in place, knowing you have a will, a living will, a healthcare directive, financial power of attorney, getting those documents together, having them in place early on before crisis hits is critical. So being proactive, if you will. And now let's talk about conversations about finances.
One benefit of planning early for the person with the disease is that they get to have their say. They get to say, here is how I want things to play out. If there's ever a time when I can't live alone or when I need this kind of care, here's how I'd like that to happen. Here's who I want to be making decisions on my behalf if I can't make them for myself. So they get to have their say. In addition, they get to make choices about how they live their life, what they do now and in the months and years to come, with this additional knowledge of, hey, I've got this disease and here's what I can expect. And so a lot of people tell us that they choose differently, and they choose differently from each other. I talked to one person with Alzheimer's who said, you know what? I want every day to be regular. I want to work in my flower beds. I want to play with my grandkids. I want to have lunch with a friend. I just want lots of great regular days. I've talked to other folks with dementia diseases who said, I want to do the things I've been looking forward to. I want to take some big trips, or I want to do some really special things with the people I'm close to. So it's not the same for everybody, but the person with the disease gets to make choices and gets to live life more on their terms.
So Ms. Drew again makes a great point. Getting their input. They can share, they can plan, they may be able to do some things. I know, again, in my wife's situation, we were fortunate, even though early onset dementia had been the diagnosis, we were able to plan a family trip in 2011. We did a cruise, and then in 2012, we were able to go overseas to Ireland to visit some family members. And thank God we were able to do that, because by 2013, her health and progression of the illness had been so deleterious, she couldn't function anymore. She couldn't travel, and activities of daily living were beginning to be impacted. And as I mentioned, we were fortunate in 2005, we had early planning. And I'm glad to see in the chat somebody put that Capitol Hill Village has a program to help you figure out getting your paperwork together. So that's wonderful. Be proactive, utilize that resource. So let's move on to the next slide. And we're going to talk about conversations about finances. Now that you know why financial planning is important, you're ready to learn more about how to start the financial process. Talking about money can make people feel very anxious or uncomfortable. You know, we often talk about in families, in relationships, marriages, with partners or whatever, sexual called financial intimacy. Sometimes people don't want to have those conversations. Gee, I have my own checking account. I have my hidden rainy day fund. I've got some money under the mattress, and I don't want my partner, my wife, my spouse, whomever to know this. But we need to put the proverbial cards on the table so that we can be intimate with each other. And sometimes it may be as caregivers starting the conversation, so that it will lessen the anxiety and lessen the discomfort in having those kinds of conversations. To feel more confident when starting a discussion, it could be helpful to write down your own goals and share them with the loved one. Identify which family members or close friends should be a part of the financial process, including trusted friends. Choose a calm time. That's the other thing, you know. We may have had, you know, the bill come in, you know, oh my God, you didn't pay this medical bill, blah, 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 blah. We know it. And then immediately somebody's on the defensive, or they don't want to hear it. Calm time of day. There's no crisis going on. Having that conversation in a calm sort of way. Encouraging honesty. So therefore, again, you may have to divulge some things intimately financially. You know what, sweetheart? I have had a rainy day fund. And I put this money aside just in case, you know, I'm sorry I was selfish. Maybe I'm not going to do this anymore. Let me share with you where my finances are. I've got this, I've got that. We need to pool our resources, that sort of thing. And when we're having these discussions about finances, again, it's not a one and done sort of conversation. We need to take our time. We may need to have multiple conversations. Today, we'll talk about estate planning. Where's our will? Power of attorney, that sort of thing. Tomorrow, we'll pull out all our savings accounts, or maybe all of our life insurance. Who's the beneficiaries, that sort of thing. So it's a progression, but it's important to have those conversations. Planning takes time. Focus on the easy wins, if you will. Here's some additional tips. Consider things like being patient and understanding. It can be hard to ask for and accept help, even for those who, are in the process of a chronic illness like dementia. Don't judge the person and their decisions. If the person has difficulty communicating about what's going on with them, pause and take time. So, you're trying to have a conversation. Maybe somebody's in the early stages of Alzheimer's or other forms of dementia, and they can't recall things, or they can't bring up certain words, that sort of thing. So be patient. And if the conversation becomes stressful because of maybe they have dementia or Alzheimer's or for other factors, again, step away from it, go ahead and find another time. Always try to end on a positive note and check in regularly. And we're going to hear from a caregiver who's highlighting some of these steps.
Advice I'd have for other caregivers if the conversation about finances doesn't go well at first is to keep trying. It took a while for my mom to come around, and I was exasperated. I would try to catch her at a good moment, and sometimes she'd give me a little tidbit here or there, so it might take time to just pull it all together. It's sort of trying to understand the moment if you're having a good time. What I did also was to bring up friends. My mother was very empathetic. So if I'd say, oh, remember so-and-so? They had a situation with their mom or dad or family member where something happened and the person didn't know what to do, or they didn't have understanding about it. So that was really hard on them. She'd say, oh, really? And I'd say, yeah, see, that would help me if we talked about that kind of thing, and that would usually get her. So in my case, that empathy is what I would kind of try to use for her to open up more, but continuing to do it, catching on a good day. That was key, because it took time and it was piecemeal. Small victories, just get as much as you can over time and keep at it, because there usually will be a window where you can kind of break through, or in some cases it might be someone else has to talk to them.
So like what Kim said, small wins, start small, that sort of thing. Start with a positive statement. What we mean by this, again, talking about finances can be a challenge. We're talking about something that's very intimate. Start with some positive statement. I've always admired the way you handle your finances. I want to learn more about what you're doing. I've noticed you seem to be worried about finances lately. I keep seeing you looking at your bills. What worries you most? How can I be of help? I respect your privacy, but it would give me a peace of mind to know you have financial plans in place. And I know with my late wife, again, she actually, when we first got married, taught me how to balance my checkbook and to be more financially astute at being cognizant of keeping track of things. And so when I noticed, as I mentioned earlier, how she was making out her bills, I was like, hey, Bernita, you taught me how to do this, sweetheart. Maybe you need a refresher. Let me see what's going on. And so, she shared with me the checkbook, and I kind of made a joke out of it. So I was trying to make light of it in a positive way, though. I wasn't making fun of her. I was joining it, but that relieved some of the tension. And she was able to say, oh, wow, I didn't realize I was doing ATM in the checkbook. Can you help me figure this out? So that was the entree. So try to start with a positive statement. That's always important. And also talk about, moving on to the next slide, your own financial wishes. Again, that financial intimacy. I want to talk with you about my finances so you can access them in case of an emergency. Or I really want you to understand my wishes for the future. Let's talk about what I want. So, I've got this life insurance. I want you to do this or that, that sort of thing. As my wife's illness progressed, I was able to have a conversation with my two sons. One of my sons majored in finance. He lives in Brooklyn. He's helped me with my retirement, that sort of thing. My other son luckily lives here in Montgomery County near me. So he's my healthcare person. If I have a healthcare directive, anything happens, I got to go to the hospital, he's going to make those medical decisions on my behalf. And we've signed all the paperwork in that regard. Let's just quickly click on this activity, but you have the workbook that you can look at later. So this is just a conversation about having that financial conversation. And here's some tips that can be of help to you. So the worksheet you can go through at your own leisure. Let's move on and talk about financial abuse and fraud and how to avoid it. Okay. On average, how much money do Americans age 80 and older lose each year as a result of financial abuse? The answer is, believe it or not, $39,000. Studies show that financial exploitation is the most common form of elder abuse, and yet only a small fraction of these incidents are reported. You know, somebody gets that call and, hey, why don't you donate to such and such and such and such? Give me your credit card number, or what's your social security number? Or you get a lot of, things that come in the mail and you're like, oh, okay, I'll donate to this. I'll give money to that. Or, see something else and you're like, okay, I'll just help support this or that to your own detriment. Moving on to the next slide, when we're talking about financial abuse and dementia. Financial crimes against older Americans are a growing problem. This abuse can occur anywhere, including at home and in care settings. People living with dementia are especially at high risk to becoming victims of fraud and financial abuse because they're not able to remember or report what's going on. As memory and other thinking skills decline, they may struggle to make good financial decisions. So it's important to make sure we have somebody that we can trust, ourselves as spouses, our adult children, things of that nature that can be involved. But we're here from an expert in terms of this as well.
People living with dementia are more susceptible perhaps to fraud and financial abuse than other people because they have a disease that's attacking their brain. And so their ability to solve problems, to think about things logically, to have insight may be impaired, and they may be able to be tricked by people they trust or people who seem nice or seem trustworthy in a way that they wouldn't have been at an earlier time.
Okay, so moving on to the next slide. Signs a person may be having some financial issues: piles of unopened bills, electricity, gas, or other utility bills aren't being paid. They may have made a large purchase or an unusual purchase, buying some things more than once, giving money, as I mentioned earlier, to telemarketers, things that come in the mail, missing money or unexplained withdrawals. Let's go on to the next slide. And how do we lower risk for abuse and fraud? And why don't we just quickly click on hearing from a caregiver. Let's skip the activity.
One of the things that I did,
time.
my father was very proud. He really didn't want to admit that he had Alzheimer's. So I wanted him to be able to continue to feel good about himself. So I actually set up a checking savings account for him that was joint with me, because again, I had power of attorney, so I could move things around a bit. I made sure that he always had $200 in that account. Everything else was protected, and he really didn't have access to it anymore. But he didn't know that because he still had that $200. A couple of years into his diagnosis, he actually had somebody stop at his home. He was outside working in his yard. They came by, a couple, old car, pulled up to the driveway. They had a child with them and said their child was ill. And they said they needed money for health care for this child. My father was always very generous as he became older and as he became more impaired with Alzheimer's. He became more generous. And so his inclination was to help this couple. They took him to the credit union. They asked him to withdraw all of his funds. So he did. He had access to that $200 that he knew about, and he gave it to them. They left him there in the parking lot. He walked home. So it was really awful that that happened to him, but his money was protected because of the safeguards that we had put up. Everything else was still there, and I was able to replace that $200. So we tried very hard to do everything we could to protect him financially, but also to make sure that we didn't take away his sense of self-esteem.
I like that technique, giving her dad some money. Again, for the sake of time, why don't we move on to the next slide. Identifying quickly some financial and legal needs, looking at income and spending, taking inventory of assets and debt. So what are our assets? House, car, savings, things of that nature. We're still paying on mortgage, or we're paying off other debts, identifying the cost of care. Do you have a sense what would it be to have a home health care aide come in? How much might it cost for assisted living, things of that nature? You can take many of these action steps, and again, some of the workbook that you either have gotten already from earlier from Capital Care or Megan. I think she sent that out, or you can follow up with Megan. She'll make sure you get it. But let's move on to the next slide for the sake of time. Funding sources, again, some personal resources. If you've got a 401k, you've got savings, stocks, personal property, some federally funded things that can be helpful funding sources, Medicare Part A and B. If you're a veteran, make sure you're tapping into your veterans benefits. As I mentioned, as my wife was not able to work and her health deteriorated, we applied for and we were successful in getting Social Security disability insurance. So that gave us some additional income, that sort of thing. Also, state-funded resources. So there's different states that offer different funding and resources that can be of help. Medicaid, Medigap, benefits, checkup.org is another thing. And again, the workbook will have this. You can also be in touch with the Alzheimer's Association, 1-800-272-3900. They could, through our trained counselors, refer you to additional resources. Why don't we go to the next few slides? Tips for legal planning real quick. Legal planning, make sure a person can designate a trusted family member. Make sure you have your legal plans in place as early as possible. And so everyone's prepared. Get advice from an attorney that can be helpful. So we'll move on. We won't click on this caregiver slide. Let's talk about the resources. So legally, the Alzheimer's Association at AARP, if you're a member of AARP, has a community resource finder. You can find that off of our website at alz.org, CRF, Community Resource Finder. Elder Care Locator, National Elder Care Law Foundation. So those are some legal resources, financial resources, Association of Financial Planners, Consumer Credit Counseling Services. So hopefully, again, these can be guide points for you to further get into your own personal situations, maybe referring you to an actual legal expert or financial planner that can talk about your respective unique circumstances about how to best plan for the future, have things in place. Moving on to the next slide. Always make sure you have a backup plan. Who's going to be there as a family or friend member that can make some difficult decisions for you or on your behalf. Also making sure you have up-to-date medical information for the person, their medications, contact information. Again, my son here in Montgomery County has medical power of attorney. He's got a list of all my meds. He's got a list of all my doctors. So if anything comes up, and he and my other son in New York are designated power of attorney for different things. So making sure we have those sorts of plans. I also have my sister listed as another backup person for medical reasons in case my son here in Silver Spring is out of town. So planning, take care of your health. Again, I can only re-emphasize, as I mentioned, as caregivers, we need to make sure we're taking care of ourselves. So we're better positioned to take care of our loved ones who might have Alzheimer's or other chronic illnesses, making sure we are going to the doctor regularly. And again, I know in the midst of the pandemic, people were putting aside going to the doctor, making sure, again, as caregivers, we're eating well. We're looking into respite care. I know the VA support group that I do, often that comes up. Our caregivers often, again, more often than not, wives, they're stressed. Some of them have reached out to the VA and gotten care support and respite care support. Or they take some breaks, they go for a walk, that sort of thing. If a family member, a church member, a neighbor is offering help, don't be the proverbial John Wayne, well, pilgrims, let's circle the wagon. I can do this myself. Get help. Build a caregiving team to assist with caregiving responsibilities. Somebody's willing to come over, and be part of the casserole brigade so that you don't have to cook that night, accept it. Somebody's willing to just sit for half an hour while you run an errand, accept it, so that you feel at ease and you can take care of yourself and take care of some other things. Moving on to the next slide. Again, we can be a partner. I'm glad Capitol Hill Village is taking some great steps and providing great resources for you all, but we can partner with you all in that regard too. As I mentioned, our 24/7 helpline, trained counselors can speak any language imaginable. Our alz.org has a lot of resources that you can go through our different pages. If you're looking for a particular community resource, the alz.org Community Resource Finder can provide those particular resources in your area, whether we're talking about in the District of Columbia proper, or we're talking about Montgomery County, Prince George's County, the various counties in Northern Virginia. And that's all of what the National Capital Area, our chapter, covers in the DMV area. So why don't
Michael, let's stop here and
I was gonna say that, Lowell.
yeah.
Thank you. Why don't we stop here, see what we have in the chat, and proceed with answering any questions. Thanks.
Doesn't look like anybody has specific questions in the chat. I just put some additional resources that you mentioned, Michael. But if anybody has anything that they would like to go off mute for, any specific questions, feel free to do so now.
I think, thank you so much, Michael. I think it's really important that, you know, you have people in place to help. However, what happens if something happens to those people? Are there other people that you can also include? And, you know, essentially people are going to need access to your resources to be able to execute the plans that you desire.
Looks like we do have a question.
Okay.
If you'd like to ask, I'd like to ask, how do you know if you have Alzheimer's?
So the first thing to do is to talk to your doctor, and they can do some different cognitive tests to sort of start the process. And if they're concerned, they will refer you on to a neurologist or a geriatrician who can perform further tests.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions from anybody else? And I do just want to mention as an add-on to that previous question that Capitol Hill Village Care Services staff is here to support people who might be thinking that either themselves or a family member or their partner may be dealing with a dementia-related disease. And we can work with you to try to set up some resources and offer support.
I have a quick question.
Yeah, Tom.
Thanks for having this, doing this, Megan. Mr. Smith, are there any programs in the district for those of us, I think all of us live here in the city, that subsidize the cost of care? You know, the cost of care, and if there are, what how do those programs work? I assume they're dependent on income, but
sure. So the DC Department of Aging might be a starting point to see what services through the city you're eligible for, and they might provide other resources. Again, going to our 1-800-272-3900 helpline, they may be able to come up with some additional resources. Laura, I don't know if you have additional thoughts.
Yeah, I think it's very dependent on where you live. So I would definitely start with, I mean, and Megan, maybe you know, but I would start, it's going to have to be, it's going to, oh, look, from Elizabeth, the DC Caregivers Institute is also a good resource.
Oh, great.
But I would go, you're going to have to go through the Department of Aging.
Yeah, and I would say once again, the care services team is here to help you identify resources and navigate them. So like Elizabeth mentioned, the DC Caregivers Institute is a great one to check out. And if it's specifically home care related that you're trying to get subsidized, the EPD waiver in DC is one thing that you can pursue.
What is that?
And
I'm sorry.
it's the Elderly and Persons with Disabilities waiver. And we can talk more offline about it,
All right.
Tom, if you like.
Yeah.
And it is income based, but it will, once you get approved financially and also with what you need, making sure you do need the aid services, they do both of those assessments and you can get your home care covered through that waiver. But there's a lot of parameters, a lot of financial parameters and asset related limits to that program.
Okay.
But we can talk more if you want to, just let me know.
Yeah, let's talk about that. Before the pandemic, there was actually some program that I think was actually in place that allowed for some sort of offset for home care expenses. And I think that I heard about it through the support group that I was in before the pandemic. This program required some sort of orientation. You attended an orientation, and then after you completed it, there would actually be some sort of offset against the home care expenses. And I didn't think it depended on income or anything else, but I imagine it's been 3 years since I learned about it, and I imagine the pandemic has may have caused that program to be canceled. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not sure either. I'm not familiar with that program. But I wonder if maybe the DC Caregivers Institute might have some more information about that.
Right.
Well, anything else before we sign off?
Michael, thank you so much as always. Really appreciate it.
Yes, thank you. And
Sure.
thank you everybody for joining us today. And this is going to be, like I said, it has been recorded. So if you want to go back and just review anything that you missed or forget something, it'll be up on our website in the next week or so. So those resources are there for you. And you can also reach out to the village, the Alzheimer's Association, if anything comes up in the future.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Megan.
All right. Have a good night.
Thanks, everybody.
Take care.
Take care.